Welcome back. Tonight, we step into a world of candlelight and crystal, where champagne glasses catch the light, and the laughter of the wealthy fills every gilded room. A world where everything appears perfect, but beneath that perfection, something darker was waiting. Harrington Hall, a grand winter gathering. Dozens of guests dressed in their finest, and at the heart of it all, a staircase, the diamond staircase. 40 steps of pale stone, spiraling upward into the darkness above. By midnight, those same steps would carry something else entirely, a trail of crimson blood, and at the bottom, Sir Edmund Harrington, dead. Scotland Yard would call it a tragedy, the guests would call it an accident, but one man, a small, precise Belgian with an immaculate moustache, would call it exactly what it was: murder. This is the story of one night, one staircase, one death, and the meticulous mind that refused to let it go unanswered. Stay with us. The gathering at Harrington Hall. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday. Hercule Poirot had been sitting in his flat on Whitehaven Mansions, half reading a letter from a retired colonel in Dorset, who believed his gardener was poisoning his roses, when the cream-colored envelope appeared on his breakfast tray. He had turned it over once, noted the embossed crest, a stag above 2 crossed swords, and set down his tisane with the particular care of a man who senses that something is about to become complicated. Sir Edmund Harrington requests the pleasure of your company at Harrington Hall, Devonshire, for the winter gathering, Friday the 9th of December. Poirot had not been acquainted with Sir Edmund personally. He knew of him, of course. One always knew of Sir Edmund Harrington. The man occupied a certain position in English society, the kind of position built not entirely on merit, but on inheritance, on the right schools, the right clubs, the right marriages. He was 61 years old, twice widowed, and possessed of a fortune that had survived 2 wars and one rather spectacular court case involving a disputed will in 1947. He was not, by most accounts, a pleasant man, but he was a powerful one, and powerful men, Poirot had long observed, had a remarkable tendency to end up at the center of unpleasant situations. The invitation had come with a small handwritten note attached, in a different hand entirely, hurried, slightly uneven, as though written in some agitation. Monsieur Poirot, I urge you to come. There are things at Harrington Hall that trouble me greatly. I cannot say more in writing. Please. M.V. Poirot had read the note 3 times. Then he had folded it carefully, placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, finished his tisane, and reached for the telephone. He had accepted the invitation. Harrington Hall revealed itself slowly, the way grand things sometimes do, first as a smudge of pale stone through the bare December trees, then as a suggestion of towers and chimneys against a grey sky, and finally, as the motorcar turned through the iron gates, as something almost overwhelming in its size and severity. It was a large Jacobean house, 3 stories of cold stone, with tall windows that reflected the failing afternoon light. The grounds were immaculate even in winter, gravel raked, hedges trimmed to sharp angles, the skeletal rose gardens arranged in precise geometric patterns. Everything about it spoke of order maintained at considerable expense and effort. Poirot stepped from the motorcar and stood for a moment on the gravel drive, his breath misting slightly in the December air. He wore his warmest overcoat, a dark wool affair with a velvet collar, and had taken the precaution of adding a second muffler, a decision he now congratulated himself on. England in December was, in his considered opinion, a country engaged in a sustained personal assault upon the Belgian constitution. He collected his small bag from the driver, tipped the man precisely, and turned toward the entrance. Inspector Japp was already there. Poirot saw him standing just inside the open front door, hands in his overcoat pockets, speaking to a young footman with the particular expression of a man who has asked a question and is not satisfied with any of the available answers. He looked up as Poirot approached, and his weathered face arranged itself into something between relief and mild resignation. Poirot. He said it the way he always said it, as though the word itself was a minor inconvenience he had learned to live with. Mon ami. Poirot stepped inside, nodded thanks to the footman, and looked around the entrance hall with quiet attention. I did not expect to find you here. You also received an invitation? Didn't receive one, exactly. Japp lowered his voice slightly. Got a telephone call this morning from Sir Edmund's solicitor. Apparently Sir Edmund himself requested that someone from Scotland Yard attend the gathering. Said he had concerns about his personal security. Japp paused. Didn't say what kind of concerns. Interesting. Poirot removed his muffler with small, precise movements and handed it to the waiting footman. And Scotland Yard obliges a wealthy baronet's request for a personal security escort. Scotland Yard obliges when the wealthy baronet in question has a brother-in-law on the Home Office committee. Japp said it without particular bitterness. It was simply a fact of the world, and he was a practical man. Poirot permitted himself a small smile. Naturellement. The other guests had largely arrived by the time Poirot and Japp were shown to their respective rooms. Poirot to a well-appointed chamber on the second floor, overlooking the east garden. Japp to something slightly less well-appointed, one corridor further along. A detail that Japp noticed, and Poirot tactfully did not comment upon. They gathered for drinks in the drawing room at 6:30. Poirot entered quietly and positioned himself near the fireplace. Not because he required the warmth, though he did, but because it afforded him an unobstructed view of the entire room. It was a habit so long established that he performed it without conscious thought. He observed. There were 11 guests in total, not counting himself and Japp, and Poirot spent the first quarter of an hour simply watching them move, speak, and arrange themselves in relation to one another. For people, he had always believed, reveal themselves most completely not in what they say, but in how they stand, and whom they choose to stand near, and whom they take care to stand away from. The first to draw his attention was Mrs. Constance Vellicott, and he was almost certain she was the MV of the troubled note. She was a woman of perhaps 45, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair beginning to show silver at the temples, and the kind of composed, careful manner that Poirot associated with people who are working very hard to appear calmer than they feel. She wore a dark green gown and held her champagne glass without drinking from it. Her eyes moved around the room with a regularity that was almost clockwork, checking, noting, returning to the door at intervals as though expecting something, or someone. She caught Poirot's eye once, briefly, and looked away immediately, but not before he had seen something in her expression, not guilt exactly, and not quite fear. Something between the two, the look of a person who has set something in motion and is no longer entirely certain they have done the right thing. Near the windows stood a younger man, 30, perhaps 32, with the lean build and restless energy of someone not entirely comfortable in formal dress. He had been introduced to Poirot as Mr. Roland Harrington, Sir Edmund's nephew, and, by current arrangement, his heir. He was speaking to a fair-haired young woman in blue, Miss Diana Forsyth, the daughter of Sir Edmund's oldest friend. But his attention was not on her. It kept sliding sideways, toward the door, or toward the older man standing by the drinks cabinet on the far side of the room. That older man was Mr. Gerald Loomis, 60, heavy-set, with the florid complexion of a man who drank well and regularly, and the careful, watchful eyes that sometimes went with such men. He was Sir Edmund's business partner, had been for nearly 20 years, according to what Japp had managed to gather from the solicitor. He spoke little, smiled often, and refilled his glass with a frequency that was either habitual or deliberate. There were others, a retired general and his wife, a young architect who seemed slightly bewildered to be there at all, a widow of some local standing, a quiet clergyman. But it was these three, Poirot noted, who formed the invisible tensions in the room. 3 points of a triangle, each aware of the others, each maintaining a careful distance. Sir Edmund himself arrived at 7 o'clock precisely. He was a tall man, still carrying himself with the upright bearing of someone who had been handsome in youth and knew it. His hair was white and thick, his face deeply lined but strong. He wore his evening clothes with the ease of long habit and moved through the room with the unhurried confidence of a man in his own house who has never had cause to doubt his welcome. He greeted his guests with the practiced warmth of a host who is performing warmth rather than feeling it. He shook hands, made brief remarks, smiled at the right moments. But when his eyes passed over Roland Harrington, something tightened, almost imperceptibly in his expression. There and gone, in an instant, like a shadow crossing a wall. When he reached Poirot, he paused. "Monsieur Poirot," his voice was measured, controlled. "I am glad you came. The pleasure is mine, Sir Edmund." Poirot met his eyes. "It is a magnificent house. It has been in the family for 200 years. There was something in the way he said it. A weight to the words, a deliberate emphasis. I intend it to remain so." He moved on. Poirot turned back to the fireplace and stood quietly for a moment, his thumbs moving together in small, slow circles. A habit he had when something had caught his attention without yet revealing its full significance. Sir Edmund had looked, in that brief exchange, like a man who was afraid of something. Not visibly, not in any way that most people in the room would have noticed, but the fear was there, controlled, compressed, locked behind the correct English manner, and to Poirot's eyes, it was as clear as a chalk mark on a dark wall. Dinner was served at 8. It was excellent, as dinners at Harrington Hall presumably always were. 5 courses, good wine, immaculate service. The conversation moved through the familiar channels of such gatherings. The weather, the state of the country, a recent production at the Haymarket, someone's opinion on the new motorway proposals. Light, surface, careful. Poirot ate moderately and listened considerably. He noticed that Roland Harrington barely touched his food, that Mrs. Vellacott spoke only when spoken to, that Gerald Loomis told 2 long stories about his time in Rhodesia that no one appeared to find as amusing as he did, that Sir Edmund, at the head of the table, maintained throughout the meal the performance of the gracious host, and that it was, unmistakably, a performance. The diamond staircase was visible from the dining room through the open double doors, a pale sweep of stone curving upward into the darkness of the upper hall, each step catching the candlelight from the wall sconces and returning it in small, cold sparks. It was undeniably beautiful. An architectural vanity from the early 18th century, the footman had informed Poirot when he arrived. 40 steps of pale Derbyshire limestone with iron railings inlaid with small pieces of polished quartz, which caught the light and gave the whole structure its name. Poirot had looked at it carefully when he arrived. He looked at it again now, through the open doors. It was the kind of staircase, he thought, that was designed to be descended, to be seen upon, to display the person upon it to their best advantage. He could not have said, precisely, why it unsettled him. After dinner, the guests retired to the drawing-room once more. Sir Edmund excused himself briefly. "Business correspondence that could not wait," he said, with a small apologetic smile, and went upstairs. It was 20 minutes past 10. Poirot accepted a small coffee from a passing footman and stood near the doorway, where he could see both the drawing-room and the entrance hall beyond, and the foot of the diamond staircase. Japp appeared at his elbow. "Quiet enough evening," he said, in the tone of a man who is not entirely sure he believes what he is saying. "So far," said Poirot. At 23 minutes past 10, they heard it. Not a scream, though there was a sound, briefly, from somewhere above. What reached them first was the other thing. A heavy, rhythmic impact. Once, twice, 3 times, descending. And then silence. And then, from the entrance hall, a woman's voice, high and fractured with shock. Everyone moved at once, but Poirot was already at the drawing-room door. Sir Edmund Harrington lay at the foot of the diamond staircase. He was on his back, one arm extended, his evening clothes disordered. His eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling with the particular quality of stillness that Poirot had seen enough times in his long career to recognize immediately and without question. And from beneath his head, moving slowly outward across the pale limestone of the lowest step and down onto the marble floor of the entrance hall, ran a thin and spreading trail of crimson. The diamond steps had their blood. The crimson trail. For a moment, nobody moved. It was the kind of moment that exists outside ordinary time. Suspended, crystalline. the way certain moments are when the world has just shifted irrevocably from one thing into another, and the people present have not yet fully understood what they are witnessing. The guests stood in the drawing-room doorway and the entrance hall in various attitudes of shock, and the only sound was the faint settling of the fire in the grate behind them, and the thin, persistent dripping of something from the third step. Then Japp was moving. "Stand back, please. Everyone stand back." His voice carried the flat, practiced authority of 25 years in the Metropolitan Police, and people obeyed it without quite knowing why. They drew back, reshuffled themselves against the walls and door frames, and watched with wide eyes as Japp crossed the entrance hall in quick strides and crouched beside Sir Edmund's body. Poirot did not hurry. He moved to the edge of the hall and stopped, and stood very still, and looked. This was the thing that sometimes frustrated Japp, had frustrated him for years in point of fact. At a scene such as this one, every instinct pushed toward action, toward kneeling, touching, questioning, doing. Poirot did none of these things immediately. He simply looked, with those sharp, slightly tired eyes moving carefully and without haste, across everything in his field of vision, the body, the steps, the walls, the faces of the people around him, as though he were reading a page of very small print, and could not afford to miss a word. Sir Edmund lay at the base of the staircase, with his head toward the bottom step, and his feet extended outward across the marble floor. He had fallen, or been placed, Poirot noted the distinction carefully, with a kind of terrible symmetry, his arms at angles that suggested the impact of a rapid descent rather than a controlled one. His collar was torn slightly at one side. His right shoe had come half off. The blood was coming from the back of his head. It had pooled on the lowest step and run in a thin, deliberate line down the riser and across 3 feet of marble floor, following some invisible gradient in the stone, curving slightly to the left. In the candlelight it was very dark, darker than people who have not seen such things generally expect blood to be, and it caught the light in a way that was almost grotesquely decorative against the pale stone. Poirot looked at the staircase itself. 40 steps of pale Derbyshire limestone curving upward to the landing above, the iron railings with their inlaid quartz, the wall sconces burning steadily on either side. From where he stood, he could see perhaps 20 steps clearly before the curve of the staircase took them out of his sight line. He looked at the steps he could see. Nothing disturbed on the near ones, no scuff marks, no displaced objects, nothing on the smooth stone surface. His eyes moved upward. On the 7th step, he counted carefully, there was something dark on the stone near the right-hand railing. Small, irregular in shape, he did not move toward it yet. On the 14th step, the railing had a small bright mark on the iron, a scrape, fresh, the kind of mark left when metal contacts metal, at speed or under pressure. He filed both observations away. "He's gone." Japp straightened up from beside the body, his face set and grim. No pulse. Still warm, though. This is very recent. He looked up at Poirot with the expression of a man assembling the available facts into their most obvious shape. Fell down the stairs. Back of the head's taken the worst of it. Caught the edge of a step on the way down, I'd say. Possibly more than once. Possibly, said Poirot. Japp looked at him. He had known Poirot long enough to hear entire paragraphs in a single word. "You're going to tell me it wasn't an accident." "I am going to tell you nothing yet." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "I am still looking." Japp made a sound that was not quite a sigh and turned back to the practical necessities, getting the local police telephoned, getting the guests kept together, getting the servants assembled. He was good at these things. He was, Poirot had always acknowledged privately, an excellent policeman in the ways that most mattered in the immediate aftermath of a sudden death. He moved efficiently, spoke clearly, and did not panic. Poirot, meanwhile, began to move. He started at the body and worked upward. He crouched beside Sir Edmund first, carefully, with a small grunt of effort that he would not have admitted to a year ago, but which his knees now insisted upon regardless, and looked at the man closely. The torn collar, the displaced shoe, the position of the hands, both slightly curled, the left more so than the right. the knuckles of the left hand showing a faint redness that might have been impact or might have been something else entirely. He looked at Sir Edmund's face. The expression of a man surprised, he thought. The eyes not screwed shut, not contorted, open with a quality of sudden startlement that death had preserved. He noted this and stood, with somewhat more effort than the crouching had required, and began to climb. He went slowly, placing each foot with deliberate care, his eyes moving across the surface of each step before he committed his weight to it. The limestone was smooth and very slightly cold through the thin soles of his evening shoes, not slippery, he noted, not wet, not dusty, well maintained, as everything in Harrington Hall was well maintained. At the 7th step he stopped and crouched again. The dark mark he had seen from below was, on close inspection, a small smear, perhaps 2 centimeters across, irregular at the edges, on the stone surface near the right-hand railing. He leaned close without touching. It was the same color as the blood below, though dried or drying at the edges. He studied it for a long moment. It was not a footprint, nor a handprint, nor a droplet from a wound. Its shape suggested contact. Something pressed briefly against the step and then removed, or something dragged. He stood and continued upward. At the 14th step, he examined the scrape on the railing. It was recent. The bright metal beneath showed clearly where the outer surface had been marked. The mark was approximately 4 inches long and angled downward, which told him something about the direction of the force that had caused it. He looked at the corresponding position on the wall side of the staircase. Nothing. He looked at the step itself, clean, undisturbed. He looked upward. The staircase curved away from him, and at the top of the curve, just before the landing, the wall sconce threw its light differently. A slight shadow, where something projected very slightly from the wall. Poirot climbed the remaining steps with increasing care and reached the landing. He stood very still. The landing was a wide, well-lit space with a corridor extending in both directions, left toward the guest wing, right toward Sir Edmund's private study and the master apartments. A console table stood against the wall opposite the stairhead, bearing a vase of winter roses and a small framed photograph. The carpet runner on the landing was a deep Persian pattern in burgundy and blue, and on the carpet, roughly 3 feet from the top of the staircase, there were marks. Not blood, or not primarily. 2 parallel impressions in the deep pile of the carpet, each perhaps 6 inches long. The kind of marks left when something heavy has been dragged or pushed. They began approximately 3 feet from the stairhead and ended at the very top step. Poirot stood over them and looked at them for a considerable time. Then he looked at the thing that projected from the wall, a small iron bracket, the kind used to hold a wall sconce, except that this one was empty, the sconce that should have hung from it missing, and the bracket itself bent very slightly downward, at an angle that did not appear original to its installation. He reached out and touched the bracket carefully with one finger. It moved. Not much, but it moved, recently loosened from the wall. He withdrew his hand and stood quietly on the landing, his eyes half closed, his thumbs moving in their small, slow circles. A picture was assembling itself in his mind, still incomplete, still with blank spaces where the essential details had not yet declared themselves, but assembling, piece by piece, with the particular logical momentum that he had come to trust over many years. Downstairs, Japp had established a provisional order. The guests had been moved back into the drawing room, all of them, with a young constable borrowed from the village posted at the door, and told that they would be required to remain until the police had attended. 2 of the women were visibly shaken. The retired general had taken charge of the drinks cabinet with the calm authority of a man who considers this a useful contribution to any crisis. The young architect sat alone near the window, staring at his hands. Mrs. Constance Velicott sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace. Her face was white, not the pallor of fainting, but the controlled white of a person exercising iron restraint over their own reactions. She had not wept. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on some middle distance, and she did not speak to anyone. Roland Harrington stood near the door, slightly apart from the others. He had loosened his evening tie, an unconscious gesture, Japp suspected, performed without awareness. His expression was difficult to read. Not grief, exactly. Not shock in the ordinary sense. Something more complicated and more guarded. Gerald Loomis was the one who surprised Japp. Of all of them, Loomis appeared the least affected. He had accepted a large whiskey from the general without ceremony, sat himself in a comfortable chair, and was now engaged in what appeared to be a perfectly calm survey of the room, his eyes moving from face to face with a methodical, unhurried attention that struck Japp as not entirely natural to the circumstances. When Poirot came back downstairs, Japp met him in the entrance hall. "Well?" Japp kept his voice low. Poirot was quiet for a moment. He looked back up the staircase once, and then at the body, which remained where it had fallen. The local police surgeon had not yet arrived, and nothing was to be moved. "The wound to the back of the head," Poirot said, equally quietly. "You observed it closely. Blunt impact, consistent with striking a step edge on the way down." "Consistent with," Poirot said. "Yes, but there is a particular quality to a wound sustained in a fall. The angle, the distribution. I should like the surgeon to look very carefully." He paused. "I should also like someone to look for a missing wall sconce bracket from the upper landing." Japp stared at him. "A wall sconce? The bracket is there, the sconce is not, and the bracket has been recently, and forcefully, bent." Poirot looked at Japp steadily. A sconce of that size and weight, swung with sufficient force, would produce a wound of quite specific dimensions. The two men looked at each other in the candle-lit entrance hall, with the crimson trail running between them on the pale marble floor. "Murder," said Japp. He said it quietly, with the flat certainty of a man who had hoped to be wrong and was not surprised to find he wasn't. "Someone," said Poirot carefully, "brought Sir Edmund to the top of that staircase, or met him there. And then Sir Edmund went down." He looked at the staircase one final time, the pale stone, the quartz catching the candlelight, the dark trail descending. "The diamond steps do not lie, mon ami, but the person who used them most certainly does." He turned toward the drawing room. "Now," he said, almost to himself, "let us go and look at the living." The guests under the lens. The drawing room had changed in atmosphere since dinner. 2 hours ago it had been a room of champagne and careful conversation, of people performing their best versions of themselves for one another's benefit. Now it was something else, the same furniture, the same walls, the same fire burning in the same grate, but with all the performance stripped away by shock and replaced by something rawer and less managed. People in extremity, Poirot had long observed, become more themselves. The social armor develops hairline cracks. The careful distances maintained at dinner tables and cocktail parties begin, under sufficient pressure, to collapse. He stood just inside the drawing room doorway for a moment and looked at the room. 11 people. One of them, almost certainly, had walked up a staircase this evening with a deliberate purpose and had come back down it alone. One of them was sitting here now, in this firelit room, with that knowledge inside them, managing it, containing it, presenting to the room whatever face they had decided upon. Poirot found this thought neither dramatic nor disturbing. It was simply the situation, and situations were to be dealt with methodically. He began. He did not conduct formal interviews, not yet. That would come later, with Japp and notebooks and the machinery of official inquiry. What Poirot wanted now, in this first fluid hour, before people had fully composed their accounts, was conversation. Informal, seemingly casual, the kind that people do not recognize as examination until it is already over. He moved to the fireplace first, where Mrs. Constance Vellicott still sat in her high-backed chair. "May I?" He indicated the chair beside her. She looked up. Something moved in her eyes. Relief, perhaps, or the particular anxiety of a person who has been waiting for something and is not sure whether its arrival is good or bad. "Please," she said. Poirot sat. He did not speak immediately, which was deliberate. Silence, applied correctly, was one of the most useful instruments available to him. He gazed at the fire for a moment, with the appearance of a tired man, grateful for warmth, which was in fact not entirely an appearance. It had been a long evening, and the December cold had settled into him with the particular persistence it reserved for people who had not been born to it. "A terrible thing," he said at last, conversationally. "Yes." Her voice was steady, controlled. "You knew Sir Edmund well, I think." A fractional pause. "We were acquainted, through mutual friends. I have attended this gathering before. Twice, I believe." "Ah," Poirot nodded slowly. "And it is always so large a company, usually." Sir Edmund enjoyed, she stopped, corrected herself with visible effort. Sir Edmund enjoyed entertaining. He was a sociable man. He was a man who liked to have people around him. She said it carefully, as though choosing each word from a larger available selection and discarding the ones that said too much. Poirot looked at her profile. She was staring at the fire, and in the firelight, the composed lines of her face showed the effort of their composition more clearly than she perhaps realized. There was something she was not saying, something large and pressing that was making the careful management of everything else considerably more difficult. "Madame Vellicott," he said quietly. "The note." She turned to look at him. Her expression did not change dramatically. She was too controlled for that. But something in the set of her shoulders altered slightly, as though a weight had shifted. "I wondered when you would mention it," she said. "You sent it, I think, because something concerned you, something specific." He kept his voice very level, very gentle. "I would find it helpful to know what that something was." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled in the grate. Across the room, the general said something to his wife in a low, rumbling tone, and she replied in a murmur. "I saw something," Mrs. Vellicott said at last. "3 weeks ago, I was here. Sir Edmund had asked me to come down for a weekend, some documents he wanted witnessed. I arrived a day early, unexpectedly. The housekeeper let me in." She paused. "I heard voices from the study, raised voices. Sir Edmund and someone else. You recognized the other voice?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "It was Mr. Loomis, Gerald Loomis. He was—" The words I caught were fragments, only fragments, but he was angry, genuinely angry, in a way I had not heard from him before. And Sir Edmund was— She seemed to search for the word, cold. The way he could be cold when he had decided something. And what had he decided, do you think? "I believe," she said slowly, "that he had decided to dissolve the partnership, to remove Mr. Loomis from the business entirely." She looked at Poirot directly for the first time. There had been rumors, financial irregularities, someone had said, though I don't know the details. Sir Edmund was not a man who tolerated looseness in financial matters. Poirot nodded once, thoughtfully. "You did not speak to Sir Edmund about what you had heard." "I left without announcing myself. She stopped. "I was not sure what I had heard, and I did not wish to involve myself. But then the invitation came, and I thought, if I were there, if I could speak to you, if something was truly wrong." She pressed her lips together briefly. "And I should have spoken sooner, I know that." "You are speaking now," Poirot said simply. He rose from the chair with a small bow. "Thank you, Madame Vellicott. I would ask you to say nothing of this to the others." She nodded. He moved away. Gerald Loomis was on his second, or possibly third, large whiskey, seated in a leather armchair with his heavy legs crossed and his florid face arranged in an expression of sober regret that sat, Poirot thought, rather uneasily on features more accustomed to self-satisfaction. "Dreadful business," Loomis said, as Poirot settled into the adjacent chair. He had a big voice, Loomis, the kind that assumed its own welcome in any room. Edmund of all people. Man was as sure-footed as anyone I've known. Terrible thing, a fall like that. Indeed. Poirot accepted a small glass of brandy from a passing footman and held it without drinking. "You and Sir Edmund were in business together for many years, I understand." 19 years. Loomis said it with a certain weight, as though the duration itself were an achievement. "Built the company from relatively modest beginnings. Edmund had the name, the capital. I had the—" he smiled broadly, "operational instincts, shall we say. A productive arrangement. Very. Though all arrangements have their adjustments over time. Natural enough. He was watching Poirot with those careful eyes that the large, easy manner was designed to conceal. "You're the detective fellow, aren't you? The Belgian." "I am. Here socially, I take it?" There was something underneath the casualness, a slight sharpening of attention, quickly smoothed. "I was invited," Poirot said pleasantly. "As were you. It was a gathering of people important to Sir Edmund, I think. People he wished to have near him." He let that sit for a moment. "Did he seem to you this evening like a man with something on his mind?" Loomis considered this with an air of great thoughtfulness. Edmund always had something on his mind. Driven man. Couldn't leave business alone even at a dinner party. He shook his head with an expression of fond exasperation. "Last time I spoke to him was before dinner, in the entrance hall. He said he needed to speak to me tomorrow morning. Had something to go over." He picked up his whiskey glass. "Tomorrow morning? Well." He drank. Poirot watched him. The remark about tomorrow morning was delivered with precisely the right degree of rueful irony. The timing of it, the inflection, the slight shake of the head following it. It was, Poirot thought, very nearly perfect. The performance of a grieving business partner who is also, incidentally, establishing that his last interaction with the deceased was entirely mundane. Nearly perfect. But Loomis had held his glass a half-second too long before drinking, in the way that people sometimes do when they are waiting to see whether a thing they have said has landed as intended. Poirot rose. "A sad evening for us all," he said, with a small, conventional bow. "Thank you, Mr. Loomis." Roland Harrington had moved away from the door and was now standing near the far window, looking out at the darkness of the December grounds with his hands in his pockets and his evening tie still loosened. He turned when Poirot approached, and his expression was the complicated one Japp had noticed earlier, guarded, layered, not easily read. He was a good-looking young man, dark, lean, with a directness in his eyes that Poirot found, on the whole, more interesting than Loomis's careful sociability. "Monsieur Poirot," he said it without preamble or the conventional social softening. "You've been working the room." "I have been speaking with people," Poirot agreed mildly. "Same thing." He looked at Poirot with a frank appraisal. "You don't think it was an accident?" It was not a question, and Poirot did not treat it as one. "What makes you say that?" Roland was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the December wind moved through the bare trees, and the darkness pressed flat and total against the glass. "My uncle," he said at last, "was not a man who fell down staircases. He was 61 years old and in excellent health. He had lived in this house for 30 years. He knew every step of that staircase. He turned back to the window, and he was frightened of something. Had been, for several weeks. I noticed it the last time I visited, a month ago. He was watchful, in a way I had not seen before. Did he say anything to you? Give any indication of the nature of this fear? No. Edmund didn't confide. It wasn't in his nature. A brief pause. He sent me a letter, 2 weeks ago, asking me to come to the gathering. He said there were matters concerning the estate he wished to discuss, family matters. Roland's jaw tightened slightly. I assumed it was about the will. He had mentioned, suggested, that he was considering certain changes. Changes in your favor? Roland looked at him directly. I'm aware how that sounds. I am not suggesting anything, Poirot said calmly. I am asking. He suggested that he was reconsidering some previous decisions. About the inheritance. Yes, he held Poirot's gaze steadily. And I am also aware that that gives me, in the conventional view, a reason to want him alive rather than dead, since whatever he was reconsidering has now died with him, and I have no idea what was in his current will. Poirot regarded him for a moment. There was, he thought, a quality of genuine uncertainty in Roland Harrington that was either entirely authentic or very skillfully constructed. The young man was either telling the complete truth or had thought through his position with considerable intelligence and was presenting its most favorable aspects with practiced candor. Both were possible. Neither could yet be ruled out. One question, Poirot said. Where were you between 10 o'clock and 10:30 this evening? Here, in this room. Roland met his eyes without flinching. I can give you 6 names if you require them. I did not leave this room after dinner." "Thank you," said Poirot. He moved away and stood for a moment alone near the door, his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes moving slowly across the room one final time. 3 conversations, 3 people, each with their own version of Sir Edmund Harrington, each with their own particular reason to be interesting. A business partner facing ruin, a nephew uncertain of his inheritance, a woman who had heard something she should not have and had been carrying it alone for 3 weeks, and somewhere in this room, or perhaps in this house, a missing wall sconce that had been used as a weapon and subsequently hidden. Poirot's thumbs moved in their slow circles. The little grey cells, as he sometimes privately called them, were working. Not yet at full capacity. There were still too many blank spaces, too many unverified claims, too many moments in the evening that he had not yet properly accounted for. He was tired, faintly. It had been a long journey down from London, and he was not, he acknowledged to himself with a certain reluctant honesty, as young as he had once been. His feet ached slightly. His eyes felt the particular dryness of a long evening. But the mind was engaged, fully, completely engaged, and it was telling him, with growing insistence, that the answer was here, in this room, in what had already been said and what had been carefully left unsaid. He simply had not found the precise shape of it yet. Japp appeared at his elbow, notebook in hand, with the expression of a man who has been managing a great many practical things and would appreciate a progress report. "Well," he said. "Anything?" Poirot considered for a moment. "Several things," he said. "But I should like, first thing tomorrow morning, to look at Sir Edmund's study. His papers, his correspondence, whatever is there." Japp nodded. "I've had it locked. No one goes in until we've been through it." He paused. "Local police are treating it as an unexplained death, pending the surgeon's report. I've told them my view." "And your view is?" Japp looked at him steadily. "Same as yours." Poirot nodded once. He looked back at the room, the guests, the firelight, the composed and watchful faces, and then looked away. "Tonight," he said quietly, "we let them sleep. Tomorrow, mon ami, we begin in earnest." Poirot's little grey cells at work. Poirot slept badly. This was not unusual in unfamiliar beds, and Harrington Hall provided a bed that was, objectively speaking, extremely good. Wide, firm, with linen that smelled of lavender and careful laundering. The fault was not with the bed. The fault was with his mind, which had declined to observe the usual courtesies of rest, and had instead continued, throughout the small hours, to turn the evening's events over and over with the patient, slightly maddening persistence of a dog, worrying at something it has not yet fully understood. He lay in the darkness and listened to the December wind move around the corners of the old house, and he thought, the wound, the scrape on the railing, the drag marks on the landing carpet, the missing sconce, the small dark smear on the 7th step. He arranged these things in order, and then rearranged them, and then arranged them again, looking for the shape that connected them, the single coherent sequence of events that would account for all of them simultaneously and leave nothing unexplained. He nearly had it, twice. Each time, something refused to fit, some detail that sat slightly wrong, some implication that pointed in a direction he had not yet fully explored. He lay with his eyes open in the darkness and wrestled with it, and at 3:30 he got up, put on his dressing gown, sat in the chair by the cold window, and thought more systematically, until the sky outside began to lighten from black to the flat grey of a December dawn. At 6 o'clock, he rang for hot water. At 6:45, immaculate and precise in his morning suit, with his moustaches perfectly attended to, for external order, he had always believed, encouraged internal order, and this morning he required all the internal order he could assemble. He went downstairs. Japp was already in the breakfast room, which did not surprise Poirot. Japp was the kind of man who slept without difficulty in any circumstances and woke early from habit. He was working through a plate of eggs and toast with the methodical efficiency he brought to most things, and he had a small pile of papers beside his plate that he had presumably retrieved from somewhere official. "Surgeon's preliminary findings," Japp said, without looking up, as Poirot settled across the table and reached for the coffee pot. "Came through half an hour ago by telephone. Local chap, but he knows his business." "And?" Japp looked up. "Blunt force trauma to the posterior cranium, consistent with a single heavy blow delivered before the fall. The fall itself caused additional injuries." He glanced at his notes. "But the head wound that killed him was not, in the surgeon's opinion, caused by contact with a stair edge. Wrong angle. Wrong shape." "The shape," Poirot said with interest. "He specifies the shape. Curved. The wound profile is curved, like the edge of something rounded, rather than the sharp right angle of a step edge." Japp set down the papers. "A rounded heavy object, swung or brought down from above and slightly behind." Poirot poured his coffee carefully. "A wall sconce bracket," he said, "of the type used throughout the upper corridor of this house, would be of approximately that shape and weight." "Yes," said Japp, "it would." They looked at each other across the breakfast table in the thin December morning light. "So," Japp said, "someone hit him at the top of the stairs, or nearby, with the sconce, removed the sconce afterward. Then, either the body fell or was assisted in falling," Poirot said. "The drag marks on the carpet suggest the latter. Someone moved him, or moved him to the edge. The staircase would do the rest." He looked at his coffee. It was, in its way, carefully considered. A fall down a staircase at that hour, in a house full of guests who have been drinking. It might very easily have been accepted as an accident. An elderly man, perhaps a little unsteady after dinner. The steps are steep. The lighting above the curve is imperfect. Would have worked too, Japp said, with the slight grimness of a policeman acknowledging a near miss. "If you hadn't been here." Poirot did not respond to this directly. He drank his coffee and set down the cup with a small, precise click. "The sconce must be somewhere in the house. It could not have been removed from the building last night. Japp, you had the doors watched." "From the moment I understood what we were dealing with. Yes. Then it is here. Hidden, perhaps quickly, perhaps not very cleverly. There was not much time, and the person who did this was operating under considerable pressure in the immediate aftermath." He rose from the table. "Shall we look at the study?" Sir Edmund's study was on the upper floor, at the end of the right-hand corridor, 20 feet, Poirot noted as they walked it, from the head of the diamond staircase. Japp unlocked the door and they went in. It was a large, well-ordered room with the particular atmosphere of a space used regularly and seriously. Not a decorative study, not a room designed for the impression of scholarship, but a working room where actual work was done. A large mahogany desk occupied the center, its surface clear except for a leather blotter, an inkstand, and a small stack of correspondence held in place by a heavy glass paperweight. Bookshelves lined 2 walls: law, finance, estate management, a shelf of history. A filing cabinet stood in the corner, locked. The curtains were still drawn from the previous evening. Poirot crossed to the desk first. He did not immediately open drawers or examine papers. He stood behind the desk chair and looked at the room from Sir Edmund's perspective, trying to understand how the man had inhabited this space. The position of the chair pushed back slightly and to the left, as though its occupant had risen quickly. The blotter, which showed the ghost of recent writing in the indentations of the leather. The paperweight on the correspondence stack. He looked at the correspondence carefully, without touching it at first. 6 or 7 letters, the topmost one still in its envelope, addressed in a handwriting he did not recognize. Beneath it, a folded document, legal, from the look of the heavy cream paper and the formal typeface visible at the edge. He picked up the document with careful fingers and unfolded it. It was 3 pages. He read it slowly, twice, and his expression did not change significantly, but something in the set of his eyes altered, a quality of attention sharpening further, the way it did when a thing he had suspected was confirmed and turned out to be simultaneously more and less than he had expected. "Japp," he said, "come and look at this." Japp came around the desk and read over Poirot's shoulder. He read in silence for a moment, then made a short sound. "That's a new will," he said. "Drawn up," Poirot said, turning to the final page. 6 days ago, Signed and witnessed. Japp read the relevant section. He's cut Roland Harrington out entirely. Entirely? The estate, the house, the capital, everything goes to a charitable trust, with a board of trustees to be appointed by the family solicitor. Poirot set the document down carefully. Roland Harrington receives a sum, a reasonable sum, but a sum, not the estate, not the house. Roland said his uncle had mentioned reconsidering things. Japp straightened up. He thought it was going to be in his favor. He believed so, yes. Poirot looked at the will for a moment longer. Or he said he believed so. He moved away from the desk to the window and drew back the curtain an inch, looking out at the grey December garden. There is a difference, you understand, between what Roland Harrington believed and what he may have discovered. If he found out, by some means, a conversation overheard, a document seen inadvertently, that the revision was not in his favor at all, that's motive enough, Japp said flatly. It is motive, Poirot agreed. Though motive alone, as I have had occasion to remark before, does not make the case. He let the curtain fall. We must also know how, and I have a question about how. He turned to the filing cabinet. Locked, as he had noted. He looked at the lock, then at the desk, then crossed back to the desk and opened the central drawer. Pencils, a pen, a small ruler, a folded newspaper cutting. He set these aside, and, in the back corner of the drawer, a small key on a plain ring. He took it to the filing cabinet. It fit. Inside the cabinet were hanging files, neatly labeled in a small, precise hand. Business correspondence, estate accounts, legal, personal. He moved through them methodically, not hurrying, reading headings and opening files briefly, and replacing them with the care of a man who intends things to be found in the same order in which he found them. In the third drawer, in the file labeled simply Loomis, Correspondence, he found what he was looking for. There were 11 letters. He read them in sequence, slowly, standing at the filing cabinet, with the drawer open and the thin December light coming through the parted curtain. When he had finished, he stood still for a moment, and then he read 3 of them again. Then he replaced them precisely, closed the drawer, locked the cabinet, and returned the key to the desk drawer. "Well?" said Japp, who had been watching him with the restrained impatience of a good policeman in the presence of a process he cannot rush. Poirot sat down in Sir Edmund's chair, which he did not normally do, taking a dead man's chair, but his feet were informing him that he had been standing for some time, and the information in those letters required him to sit down and think clearly. "Gerald Loomis," he said, "has been systematically diverting company funds for a period of at least 4 years. The letters are between Sir Edmund and his personal solicitor, not the company solicitor, a different man entirely. Sir Edmund discovered the irregularities approximately 8 months ago. He had been building his case quietly, methodically, without confronting Loomis directly, until he had sufficient documentation to proceed." Japp was very still. And then, approximately 3 weeks ago, which corresponds precisely with the argument Mrs. Vellacott overheard, he confronted him, or Loomis confronted him, having perhaps sensed what was coming. The argument Mrs. Vellacott described was, I think, the moment when Loomis understood that Sir Edmund intended to go to the authorities. Poirot looked at his hands, folded on the desk in front of him. The gathering was announced shortly after. Sir Edmund requested a Scotland Yard presence. He requested my presence. He paused. He was, I think, preparing to act. Perhaps this weekend. Perhaps he intended to make an announcement, to hand documents to Japp directly, to remove any possibility of the matter being suppressed quietly. And Loomis knew that, Japp said. Loomis knew that. Poirot was quiet for a moment. He also knew, or had reason to believe, that the new will, which cuts out the most obvious alternative suspect from meaningful inheritance, had been drawn up. He may even have known its contents, which means that the crime, if it was constructed to appear as an accident, was constructed by someone who had thought carefully about who else might be suspected and who had reasons to ensure that suspicion existed in multiple directions. Japp sat down heavily in the chair opposite the desk. He looked for a moment like a man recalculating a sum that has come out differently from what he expected. "You're saying Loomis set Roland up," he said, "as an alternative suspect. I am saying it is possible, perhaps more than possible." Poirot pressed his fingertips together and looked at the middle distance. "But there is still the matter of the how, the precise sequence of events on that staircase. And there is something, one thing, that I have not yet accounted for. Something small, something that has been sitting at the edge of my thinking since last night and declining to resolve itself." He fell silent. Japp waited. Outside the study window, the December garden was bare and grey and very still, and the old house settled around them with the particular silence of a place that knows more than it is saying. "The seventh step," Poirot said at last, almost to himself. "That small mark on the seventh step. It is not consistent with the fall. It is not consistent with the blow at the top. It is—" He paused, working it through. "It is earlier. It was made before Sir Edmund came down, which means someone was on that staircase before him." He looked up at Japp. "Someone who waited." The two men sat in Sir Edmund's study in the cold morning light, and the shape of the thing between them became, for the first time, very nearly complete. "Right," said Japp, standing up with the decisive energy of a man who has been given a direction. "I think it's time we had some proper conversations." "Yes," said Poirot. He rose from Sir Edmund's chair, straightened his jacket, and moved toward the door. Then he stopped and looked back at the desk once, at the locked cabinet, the signed will, the stack of correspondence under its glass paperweight, and his expression was, for just a moment, something quieter than professional attention, something that might have been, in another man, sadness. "He knew," Poirot said softly. "Sir Edmund knew that something was coming. He invited us here because he knew, and still it found him." He turned away from the desk and walked out into the corridor, toward the head of the diamond staircase, and the morning that was waiting. The web tightens. The house felt different in the morning. There is a particular quality to the atmosphere of a place where someone has died violently and unexpectedly, a kind of held breath, a suspension, as though the walls themselves are waiting to see what happens next. The servants moved through the corridors with the careful quietness of people trying not to be noticed. The guests had come down to breakfast in ones and twos, eaten with little conversation, and dispersed to various corners of the house with the slightly lost quality of people who have been told they cannot leave and do not know what to do with themselves. The local police had arrived at 8, a Detective Sergeant Rollins, competent and respectful in Japp's presence, and 2 constables who were stationed at the front and rear exits with the stolid patience of men accustomed to waiting. The body had been removed. The diamond staircase had been examined by Rollins the previous evening and again this morning, with photographs taken and measurements recorded. Poirot had watched the official examination without comment and without interference. He had his own notes, made in his own way, and they told him things that the official examination had not looked for because it had not known to look. At 9:30, he asked Japp to arrange for Gerald Loomis to be available. They used the small sitting room off the entrance hall, a neutral space, neither too formal nor too comfortable. Japp sat to one side with his notebook. Poirot took the chair directly across from the one in which Loomis settled himself, and for a moment simply regarded the man with a calm, unhurried attention that Loomis met with a good attempt at ease. The attempt was not quite good enough. There was a slight tension in the way Loomis held his shoulders, higher than natural, though he was working to keep them relaxed. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were very still in the deliberate way of hands that have been told to be still, rather than the natural way of hands that simply are. "Mr. Loomis," Poirot began pleasantly, "thank you for your time. I know this is a distressing morning." "Of course." Loomis's voice was steady. The big, easy manner was in place, slightly muted for the occasion, calibrated to the gravity of the circumstances. "Anything I can do to help?" "You were, as I understand it, Sir Edmund's closest business associate for nearly 2 decades. "That's right. 19 years. A long time." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "In 19 years, one comes to know a man very well. His habits, his character, His vulnerabilities, perhaps. Something moved in Loomis's eyes. Very brief. Edmund was not a man with many vulnerabilities. No? And yet, Poirot tilted his head slightly. He was a man who discovered, approximately 8 months ago, that something was wrong in his own company. Something that had been wrong for some time, quietly, carefully, wrong in a way that required considerable skill and patience to arrange. He paused. That must have been very difficult for him. The silence that followed was perhaps 2 seconds long. It might as well have been 20. "I'm not sure what you mean," Loomis said. "I think you are," Poirot said gently. "The letters in Sir Edmund's filing cabinet are quite specific, Mr. Loomis. The amounts, the accounts, the dates. Sir Edmund was, as I said, a meticulous man." He looked at Loomis steadily. He had been building the documentation for 8 months. "It is, I must tell you, comprehensive." Loomis was quiet. The easy manner had not collapsed. He was too experienced for that. But it had shifted, subtly, into something more careful and more calculating. His eyes moved to Japp briefly, then back to Poirot. "Whatever Edmund may have thought," he began, "Mr. Loomis." Poirot's voice remained perfectly pleasant. "We are not here this morning to discuss the financial irregularities. That is a matter for another time and another proceeding. We are here to discuss last evening. Specifically, where you were between the hours of 10 o'clock and 10:30. Another fractional pause. "I told you last night, in the drawing room." "For the entirety of that period?" "Yes." Poirot looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, quite conversationally, "The footman, Thomas. He was serving in the drawing room from 10 o'clock until the disturbance at approximately 23 minutes past. I spoke with him this morning." He paused. "He tells me that at some point between 10 and 10:15, he went to the kitchen to replenish the decanter of port. He was absent from the drawing room for approximately 8 minutes. Another pause. He is not able to confirm that you were in the room during those 8 minutes, Mr. Loomis. He noticed your empty glass when he returned and assumed you had stepped out briefly as well. It was precisely placed, not an accusation, a gap, a small specific gap in the confirmed timeline, offered without drama, and Poirot watched Loomis consider it. "I may have stepped out for a moment," Loomis said carefully, "to use the facilities." "Of course," Poirot nodded. "The facilities, which are located, as I noted this morning, along the corridor adjacent to the entrance hall." He let this sit. "Quite close to the foot of the staircase." Loomis said nothing. "And quite close," Poirot continued, in the same pleasant tone, "to the cupboard under the east stair. The storage cupboard. The one that the housekeeper tells me is used for odds and ends, spare candles, cleaning materials, the one that was not locked last evening." He watched something happen behind Loomis's eyes, a rapid internal calculation, the assessment of how much was known and how much was inference. Poirot had seen this calculation performed before, many times, and he had learned to wait through it without filling the silence. "I'd like my solicitor present," Loomis said at last. "That is entirely your right," Poirot said agreeably, "and I would encourage you to contact him. However," he rose from his chair, "in the meantime, I wonder if you would object to Sergeant Rollins taking a look inside that storage cupboard." He said it as though it were a minor administrative matter, a formality, something to be done and done with. And he watched Loomis's face in the half-second before the man's control reasserted itself, watched the decision being made, the calculation completed, the conclusion reached. Loomis said nothing further. Poirot nodded to Japp and left the room. The storage cupboard was 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, smelling of wax polish and cold stone. Rollins found it within 4 minutes. It had been pushed to the very back, behind a box of candles and beneath an old canvas dust sheet. A wall sconce bracket of black iron, approximately 14 inches in length, with an ornamental curve at the mounting end and a thicker weighted section at the other. The weighted end had been wiped, hastily, imperfectly, with what appeared to be a cleaning cloth, which had been stuffed behind the bracket itself. Imperfectly wiped. There was still a dark residue in the join between the weighted section and the bracket arm. the precise place that a hasty wipe would miss, the precise place that a careful forensic examination would not. Rollins bagged it with careful hands and brought it to Japp in the corridor. Japp looked at it. He looked at Poirot. "Right," he said, with the particular quietness of a man who has found what he expected to find and finds no satisfaction in it. "Right, then." But Poirot was not finished. He had gone, after leaving the sitting room, not to the storage cupboard but upstairs, back to the landing, back to the drag marks on the carpet, back to the bent bracket on the wall where the missing sconce had hung. He stood at the top of the diamond staircase and looked down. From here the perspective was different. The steps falling away in their pale curve, the entrance hall visible below, the front door, the console table with its winter roses. He could see the lowest step and the dark stain that had not yet been fully cleaned from the marble. He could see the exact position where Sir Edmund had lain. He looked at the drag marks again, 2 parallel impressions in the carpet pile, beginning 3 feet back and ending at the stairhead. He crouched and looked at them very carefully. He had examined them this morning already. He examined them again now because something had continued to bother him about them. Something that had to do with their depth and their width and their precise relationship to one another. He measured them with his hands, approximating. He stood and thought about weight and leverage and the mechanics of moving an unconscious man. And then he looked at the empty bracket on the wall. It was on the right side of the corridor, approximately shoulder height. The bracket was bent downward. He had noted this the night before. He looked at it now with the specific question in his mind that he had not had the night before. It was bent downward and to the left. He stood still and worked through the implications of that carefully, because the direction mattered. The direction told him something about where the person wielding it had been standing, and where Sir Edmund had been standing, and the angle of the blow. He closed his eyes briefly and assembled it. Sir Edmund coming along the corridor from his study, which was to the right. The corridor was well lit. Sir Edmund would have had no reason to be wary, in his own house, among his own guests. He would have been walking toward the staircase, someone waiting. The bracket was on the right wall, to strike downward and to the left. From that bracket, the person wielding it would have needed to be standing to the right of the corridor, between Sir Edmund and the study, behind him as he passed, or drawing level, reaching past him. Poirot opened his eyes. He walked to the study door and stood in the doorway and looked back down the corridor toward the stairhead. There was a small recessed alcove in the right wall, approximately halfway between the study door and the stairhead. It contained a small statue on a plinth, a bronze hunting figure, nothing remarkable. The alcove was deep enough, just, for a person to stand in it without being immediately visible from the study end of the corridor. Poirot walked to the alcove and stood in it. From here, a person of average height would be able to see the study door clearly. They would know the moment Sir Edmund emerged. They would have had, from the moment Sir Edmund turned toward the staircase, perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. Enough for someone prepared and determined. He stepped out of the alcove and stood in the corridor. He was thinking about the drag marks again, their width, the distance between the 2 parallel impressions. He thought about Gerald Loomis, 60 years old, heavy-set, a large man with considerable physical presence. He thought about the mechanics of dragging a man of Sir Edmund's size and weight to the edge of a staircase. Possible. Certainly possible. Loomis was a big man. But he thought about the depth of the impressions in the carpet. Shallow, he had noted. Both times he had examined them. Shallower than he would have expected from the dead weight of a man Sir Edmund's size being dragged by someone of Loomis's weight. He stood in the corridor and thought about this for a long time. Then he went downstairs. Japp met him at the bottom. "Loomis has asked for his solicitor and stopped talking," Japp said. "Rollins has the sconce. The forensic man is coming down from Exeter this afternoon." He looked at Poirot. "We have the weapon. We have the motive. We have a gap in the alibi. It's building, Poirot." "Yes," said Poirot. "It is building." Something in his tone made Japp look at him more carefully. But Poirot was looking at the foot of the staircase, at the pale stone steps, at the lowest one with its faint remaining shadow. "The drag marks," he said, "on the landing carpet. I have been thinking about them. And? Poirot turned to look at Japp. They are too shallow, he said. For one person, moving a body of that weight, they should be deeper. The impressions should be more pronounced. He paused. Unless the body was not dragged in the way I first assumed. Unless… He stopped. Unless what? Japp said. Poirot did not answer immediately. He stood at the foot of the diamond staircase, looking upward, and something in his expression was very still and very focused, the look of a man who has just seen, with sudden clarity, the shape of something that has been almost visible for a long time. Unless, he said quietly, there was more than one person on that landing. Japp stared at him. The house was silent around them. Somewhere in the back of the building a door closed softly, and the winter light came flat and grey through the tall windows, and the diamond staircase rose above them in its pale, cold beauty. Two of them, Japp said slowly. I do not know yet. Poirot looked at him steadily. But I intend to find out. Tonight, mon ami. I think tonight we will have our answers. He looked up the staircase one final time. I should like everyone gathered in the drawing room at 8 o'clock. Japp recognized the tone. He had heard it before, across many years and many cases, and he knew what it meant. I'll arrange it, he said. The final revelation. By 8 o'clock, the wind had picked up considerably. It moved around Harrington Hall with a low, persistent sound, finding every gap in the old stonework, the voice of a December night pressing against walls that had stood for 200 years. The drawing-room fire had been built up generously, the curtains drawn against the darkness, the chairs arranged in a loose semicircle facing the fireplace. It looked, Poirot thought, like a stage set, which was, in a sense, precisely what it was. They came in ones and twos, the retired general and his wife near the door, Miss Forsyth pale by the window, Roland Harrington standing, rather than sitting near the bookcase with his arms folded. Mrs. Vellacott took her usual chair by the fireplace and looked at Poirot briefly as she sat. He gave her a small nod. Gerald Loomis came last, with his solicitor, a thin, precise man named Hatfield. Loomis sat in the center of the semicircle with his hands on his knees and his face arranged in cooperative sorrow. Japp stood near the door. Rollins was in the corridor outside. Poirot looked at them all for a moment. Then he began. I am going to tell you what happened in this house last night, he said. Not what appeared to happen, but what actually happened, in sequence, from the beginning. He spoke without performance, without drama. These were serious matters. Sir Edmund invited this gathering for a specific purpose. He had spent 8 months building comprehensive documentation proving that his business partner of 19 years had been systematically diverting company funds. He had requested Inspector Japp's presence, not for vague security reasons, but to hand over that documentation directly at this gathering and proceed formally. He looked at Loomis. You knew this. You had known for 3 weeks, since the argument Mrs. Vellacott overheard, that Sir Edmund intended to go to the authorities. You arrived at this gathering having concluded there was only one option remaining. Loomis's solicitor leaned toward him. Loomis dismissed him with a small gesture. The opportunity presented itself naturally, Poirot continued. Sir Edmund excused himself after dinner. Correspondence that could not wait. You left the drawing room during the 8 minutes the footman was absent. You went upstairs. You removed the wall sconce from its bracket in the upper corridor. You took your position in the alcove between the study door and the stairhead, deep enough for a man to stand without being immediately visible. You waited. He paused. When Sir Edmund emerged from his study and turned toward the staircase, you struck him from behind with the weighted end of the sconce bracket. The blow was decisive. You then dragged him to the stairhead. Sir Edmund went down. You hid the sconce in the storage cupboard beneath the east stair, wiped it imperfectly in the available time, and returned to the drawing room before the footman came back with the port. That, said Loomis, with measured control, is a construction. Interesting, but a construction. There is no evidence placing me on that landing. There is the sconce, Japp said. Found in a cupboard, accessible to anyone. There is the financial documentation. which speaks to a business dispute, not murder. Loomis looked at his solicitor briefly. You have motive and a weapon with no confirmed connection to me. That is not a case, Inspector. Japp looked at Poirot. Poirot had not moved. He regarded Loomis with calm, settled attention. Neither anger nor frustration. Only patience. You are correct, he said, that what I have described does not yet constitute a complete case. Which is why I said I was going to tell you what happened. I did not say I had finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small evidence envelope. Inside, visible in the firelight, was a dark fragment no larger than a shirt button. The seventh step, Poirot said. A small mark that puzzled me from the beginning, earlier than the fall, inconsistent with everything else. It is a fragment of leather, torn from the join between the sole and heel of a shoe, the kind of tear that occurs when a shoe catches sharply on a step edge, taken at speed in the dark, in a moment of hurry. He looked at Loomis steadily. The shoes you wore last evening are currently in your room. Sergeant Rollins examined them this afternoon, with your solicitor present. Left shoe, Rollins said from the doorway. Tear at the inner heel join, consistent with the fragment recovered from the seventh step. The room was completely still. Something went out of Loomis's eyes. The calculation remained, but underneath it, for the first time, something else. The look of a man who has run a very long race and has just understood that the finishing line is not where he thought it was. He looked at the floor. Then he looked up at Poirot. Something passed between them. Not a confession, not yet, but the acknowledgement, between two men of a certain intelligence, that the game was over. Poirot gave him a small, grave nod. But he was not finished. He turned to the rest of the room, letting the tension begin to relax, and then spoke again. There is one matter remaining. I told you there may have been more than one person on that landing. I have been thinking about it all day. The relaxation stopped. The drag marks on the landing carpet were shallower than they should have been for one person moving a body of Sir Edmund's weight. I considered a second person. The weight distributed between two, producing shallower impressions. He looked at Roland Harrington. You told me you were in this room for the entire period. You offered 6 names. 4 confirmed it clearly. 2, when pressed specifically, were less certain. Roland had straightened. His arms were no longer folded. Sir Edmund's new will cut you out of the estate entirely, Poirot said. The house, the capital, all to a charitable trust. I believe you discovered this before the gathering, 2 days prior, when you came to collect personal items. The housekeeper confirmed your visit. You had access to the study. You had time, he continued quietly. You came upstairs that evening, not knowing what Loomis had planned, but angry and wanting to speak to Sir Edmund. You arrived on that landing to find Loomis already there, and your uncle already fallen. He paused. You did not call for help. You stood there and thought about the will, and you helped move him, telling yourself it was too late, that nothing could be done, that no one would believe your presence there was innocent. Roland said nothing. His face was white. I do not believe you struck the blow, Poirot said. But the law will have its own view of the choice you made on that landing. I did not kill him. Roland's voice was very quiet. I want that said clearly. I know, Poirot said. I do not believe you killed him. I believe you found him dying and made a terrible choice. Those are not the same thing. Roland looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression broke slowly, gradually, and then all at once. He was already gone when I came out onto the landing, he said. Loomis was standing there. We looked at each other, and neither of us spoke for, it felt like a very long time. His jaw tightened. He said it was an accident. He said if I called out, no one would believe either of us. He looked down at his hands. And I listened. God help me. I listened. Japp moved. The practiced, economical movement of a man who has done this many times. A hand on Loomis's arm. The quiet official words. Rollins came in from the corridor. Loomis stood without resistance, without protest. Roland stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the floor. And when Rollins spoke to him, he nodded once, as though confirming something he had already known was coming. Japp found Poirot 20 minutes later at the foot of the diamond staircase. Loomis is talking, Japp said. Confirms everything. Had been planning it since he arrived. He paused. Cold-blooded business. Yes, said Poirot. And the nephew. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong decision. The wrong decision at the wrong moment, Poirot said, is often how people end up in such places. He was quiet for a moment. He was angry, and he was greedy, and when the moment came, he made the choice those things suggested to him. They stood together at the foot of the staircase, in the empty entrance hall. It is never the house or the occasion, Poirot said at last, almost to himself. It is always the people. Always. He looked up the steps once, the pale stone, the quartz catching the light, and then looked away. Human weakness, mon ami. It leaves a trail that no amount of polish can conceal. Japp looked at him. Sounds like something you'd put on a page. Perhaps, Poirot said, or perhaps it is simply what is true. He turned from the staircase and walked toward the corridor, toward the promise of something hot, before the cold house settled fully into night. Behind him, the diamond steps rose in their pale, silent curve, catching the light from the wall sconces and returning it in small, cold sparks. Empty now, quiet, clean, as though nothing had happened at all.